Just for briefly introducing myself, my name is Günther Schefbeck. I have been working for the Austrian Parliamentary administration for around 40 years now. So I started in 1986, so it's close to 40 years. In this time, I performed different functions, but from the 1990s on, I started to become more and more interested in what might be called ICT, IT, new technologies, which in the first instance doesn't seem to be very typical for parliaments. Parliaments, of course, are quite conservative institutions. So that was one of the reasons why I got these tasks in the 1990s, for example, to conceive the first website of the Austrian Parliament, because I was known for my bizarre interests, and in those days, IT still was one of these bizarre issues. Nowadays, IT has become the basis for everything we are doing. We couldn't perform our parliamentary work without IT, like nearly all other people in other professions. All of us are depending on IT nowadays. Nonetheless, I still would claim that parliaments are conservative institutions that are not, in principle, apt to be innovation leaders. And that's, in my opinion, quite logical. Parliaments have to be conservative. Parliaments have to be very cautious about new tools, because what they are doing is so important. On the results of a parliament's work, in particular a parliament's legislative work, everyone in a society would depend. If there are any mistakes being made, if there are any breaches in the correct procedure of lawmaking due to technology or due to human errors or whatever, this would have a major impact on our legal and societal life. That's why parliaments, by nature, are not innovation leaders. Nonetheless, in the meantime, parliaments have also, private enterprises, other government institutions, and so on. Parliaments have also introduced new technologies and based their everyday business on new technologies. It's not a recent development. It started long before the internet came up and made ICT, information and communication technologies, part of our everyday life. Even in as far as I observed it in Austria and in other European countries, I know that there were earlier efforts, for example, in the US, but in Austria and other European countries, this development started already in the 1970s. And the first step in this development, in my opinion, and in my observation, in my retrospective observation, because then I was not yet working for Parliament, then I was still a pupil. The first step was law documentation. For parliaments, of course, it was most important to do their business, to do their legislative business, to know precisely about the law in force. And that was why they were driving law documentation of the law in force, and then more and more documentation of the different time layers of law, so to make visible the legal system as a living system, the legal system as a dynamic system, as a system that is changing every day due to the legislative work of Parliament. The next step in the 1980s was to put legislative information on a new technical basis. Legal information in some countries was already available, but not yet the information about how this law in force had entered into force, how it had been developed, how it had been conceived, how it had been adopted by Parliament. So the next step was legal after legal information was legislative information. That was the time when computers had already become smaller. You know that in the 1980s, the personal computer had been introduced. It was no longer the mainframes only, these huge, monstrous pieces that were accessible only by a very few people. Now that the PCs had come about, everyone, at least in administration, who was dealing with the issues we are talking about, had access to computers, was able to input information, and of course also was able to have access to the output information that was provided by the database systems that in those days were used to store information, relational database systems. In the 1990s, all that information that had been collected so far very suddenly was made available to a larger audience, to the general public. And that was made possible by the internet coming up. You know, the internet itself, of course, is much older. ARPANET was the first step, and then it developed into what we are calling the internet. But the major technological innovation that made this step possible was the HTTP protocol, as you know. And a very few years later only, nearly all public institutions in Europe and also all parliaments in Europe came up with the idea, we also need to have access to the internet. We also need to present ourselves on the internet, because that's a new media that will make it possible to us to achieve that level of transparency that a parliament should have. So transparency more and more became a key issue, a key driving issue for parliaments being ready to adopt the new technologies. Transparency, of course, is a basic parliamentary function. It is a core function because if the lawmaking process wasn't transparent, it wouldn't find the acceptance with society that it needs to be not only legally valid, but also socially adopted. And that means that in the mid-1990s, most European parliaments started to develop their own websites. As already mentioned, it was my very interesting, very funny task, because I learned a lot of new things that I didn't have any idea about before. It was my task to conceive the first website of the Austrian Parliament. After having made all this information that already was stored in a digital form available to the public, the pressure to on the one hand enlarge the amount of information, for example, by retro-digitizing documents from before the new IT systems were introduced, became larger and larger. And at the same time, there was a certain interest to also use the new technologies to support the legislative process in itself. Because until then, the legislative process was a totally paper-based process. Only its results were documented in digital form. And now the idea was to put the process itself on a digital basis, on an electronic workflow. And that was what the Austrian Parliament, as one of the first ones, did in 2001 already, and both other parliaments followed in the following years. Which means that in those days, we had to develop workflow systems, integrating the documentation systems that we already had. But developing workflow systems was quite a challenging task, because there was nothing we could buy off the shelf. So we had to do the development work on our own, which of course also gave us the opportunity to systematically analyze the actual lawmaking processes, and through this analysis, we also were able to improve these processes. So we did something which might be called process re-engineering, which is obviously not an easy task in a parliament where the processes are laid down in rules of procedure that very often are ranking as a law. So the administrative parts of the processes could easily be changed. The legal parts of the processes laid down in rules of procedure could only be changed with some delay in time when political decision makers, members of parliaments had been convinced that these new technologies were safe and that changing the procedures in accordance with the opportunities that these new technologies would offer us wasn't dangerous, and even offered a parliament the opportunity to save money. That's one of the observations that I have made over all these years. The best possible argument to convince political decision makers that technical innovation is very obviously that it would help them to save money. Budget pressure is always there, and if you can save money and use the money for something else, then you will easily get political decision makers on board. So this was the development until the 2000s. So to say, the next step after the electronic support of lawmaking, of course, was authentic publication of the laws. Austria, for example, did it from 2004 on in digital form. Many other countries followed. So nowadays, the traditional paper-based law gazette nearly everywhere has been replaced by digital law gazette. But the appearance very often, which is also a funny observation, the appearance very often is very similar to the paper-based documents before, which again would indicate the conservative tendency that is to be observed in lawmaking. So it's sort of a mimicry, so to say, a digital mimicry of the traditional paper-based publication formats. Nonetheless, these formats offer new opportunities. Since 25 years, it's very obvious, it has been very obvious that XML is the best possible environment, is the best possible language, technically spoken, for publishing legal and legislative documents. While in the first years, we had to develop our own XML applications. Meanwhile, there are standards available that can easily be localized, that can easily be adapted to national legal systems. And maybe some of you have already heard this name, have already heard about this language, the standard language for producing, processing, publishing, and archiving legal and legislative documents is called Akumantoso, which is a term coming from an African language because it was originally developed for African parliaments and African legal systems. It has been standardized under the name Legal.ml by OASIS. So it is a standard, it is recognized as a standard. It is nowadays in use in many national parliaments, and it's used by the European Parliament as a supranational parliament, but also by international organizations like various UN organizations that are also producing documents of legal value. Standardization is one of the developments of the past 10, 15 years. Standardization normally is an indicator that a new technology becomes more or less common, that it is not innovative anymore, but has become part of everyday business. So we can say that in this past period of the last 10, 15 years, the new technologies have become part of the everyday business of parliaments. And we can use standardization as an indicator for this statement, for this argument. But at the same time, even more new technologies came up. In the past decade, it was, for example, the development, not so much a technical development, more or less an organizational and societal development of open government data, the open data movement, which of course also affected parliaments by forcing them to provide the data that they had collected in a machine processable and reusable way. More and more demand coming from publishers, from NGOs, from other public institutions to have these data available and reusable in this form. But among those developments that in the past years have affected societies, businesses, and public institutions like parliaments the most, very obviously, I have to refer to artificial intelligence, to AI. AI is nothing new, as you know. AI is a technological approach going back to the 1950s. But in the past 10 years, 15 years, it has made speedy advances like never before. It has developed to a core technology of our modern IT-based society, and I'm quite sure this is just the beginning of a development that will continue in the next years and decades. This takeoff, so to say, of AI very obviously, on the one hand, has been caused or driven by improved hardware capacity. Of course, AI applications need a lot of computer capacity, and at the same time, by the availability of big data, another keyword of this most recent development. Big data means lots of data available in machine-readable form, being there to allow AI applications to recognize patterns in them, to learn from them, so that machine learning in its supervised and in its unsupervised way has become one of these core approaches of AI. As you know, AI is a very broad range of different approaches, but machine learning is one of these core approaches. So now, parliaments nowadays, like other public institutions, have to very obviously have to deal with this new AI, with these new AI opportunities. And actually, some of them have started. One of the earliest was the Brazilian parliament. The Finnish parliament of Europe has also made an early effort to experiment with AI. Meanwhile, 5-6 years later, many parliaments have done little exercises with AI. So the Austrian parliament also did. But still, it is small applications, it is small exercises. It's not yet going into the core parliamentary functions. This will change in the years to come, which may also be seen by the fact that in the meantime, several sets of guidelines for the use of AI in Parliament are available. The IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, has published such a set of guidelines December last year. A few months before, a private initiative by a colleague of mine from the Hellenic Parliament and a German IT specialist have also produced such a set of guidelines. So you can assume that in very many parliaments all over the world, this new technology is thoroughly examined to what extent it might be used for supporting parliament, the parliamentary processes, and parliamentary work. So this was a very short overview from mostly from personal observation of the past 40 years about how innovation, in particular IT innovation in Parliament over the past 50 years has developed. But let me conclude with a little vision for the future. How may a future technical environment look like in which all the actors in the parliamentary processes, the MPs, their assistants, staffers of the parliamentary groups, staff of parliamentary administration, but also all those actors, all those agents, civil society agents that are to some extent involved in the legislative process will perform their legislative business. First of all, very obviously, you have different kinds of actors with different needs, so you will have different interfaces. But behind these interfaces, there will be the same databases, there will be the same technical tools. There will be the same models. AI applications will use models to support lawmaking in different views and at different levels. Let me, just to make it very brief, distinguish three such levels and three different kinds of models. First of all, MPs and other legal decision makers are dependent on public opinion, not just for reason of being re-elected at the next election, but also for reason of the current legislative process being in line with societal developments. That doesn't mean that parliamentary democracy, representative democracy, in any individual case has to follow a majority opinion of society. It can happen that, for good reason, Parliament has to make a decision knowing that it isn't supported by the majority of a society. Nonetheless, MPs always need to know about societal opinions, and that's the first, I would say, level that has to be supported by a lawmaking support environment. The level of analyzing the development of public opinions on issues of legal relevance. There's a lot of possible resources. It's not just the opinion polls that are easily available. It's also all that enormous bulk of data coming from the exchange of views of civil society members that, for example, would be expressed within social media. Analysis of that public discourse, of course, systematic analysis of this public discourse, of course, can only be done on the ground of technical support. Individuals are not able to follow all that discourse, and that's why this would be such an interesting and important field of application for AI, analyzing public discourse on issues of legal relevance. The second level is that I would like to briefly describe here is the level of lawmaking itself, the level of the legal texts, the legislative texts, the legal texts, draft legislation, the bills introduced, amendments, and so on, and the impact on proposed amendments, adopted amendments on the existing legal system. This is a highly complex matter, which for human lawyers is difficult to overlook. Human laws very often are specialized on one particular legal domain, but any amendment of the legal system can have an impact on other legal domains too, which at first view you might not recognize. The situation is even more complex within the European Union. As you know, the European Union is a multi-level legal system. We have the European layer, we have the national layers, and very often we also have provincial layers and so on. But all these layers have to be in line with each other. National legislation, to some extent, has to implement European legislation. At least it must not interfere with European legislation or contradict European legislation. But that's a matter difficult to analyze. And here, the capacities of artificial intelligence again may come into the play. One of the levels of such a future AI-based working environment for the actors in the legislative process will assist them in analyzing the legal system in which they are doing their legislative business, and will, for example, be able to alert them if there is a contradiction, in my example, between the European or the national layer of legislation, or a contradiction within the national layer of legislation, which then might, of course, be intentional, but that is something that the lawmaker has to know. Anyway, systematic legal analysis will be the second of these three layers that I would like to mention here. The third layer, finally, is the layer where the impact of proposed legislation, adopted legislation, on the socio-economic system will have to be analyzed. If legislation is about steering society, if legislation is thought to have a steering function, then it has to be checked, it has to be evaluated whether this intention to steer society, to steer economy in a particular direction is to be achieved by a particular piece of legislation or not. So on the one hand, this level will include anticipative evaluation and ex-ante evaluation of future legislation, of the impact of future legislation on the socioeconomic system. On the other hand, it will apply tools to evaluate, to do an ex post evaluation of the impact of new legislation on society and economy, which of course implies the need for quite comprehensive models of societal and economic domains or subdomains, if not the ideal large societal model at all. This is what I would call a vision of some of the most important functions that in the future of Parliament, in the future of lawmaking, AI will allow us to perform. We are still far away from that point in time, but having in mind the quick development, speedy development of AI in the past years, perhaps we are not as far away as we might nowadays think. So, for conclusion, innovation in Parliament is not the primary function of Parliament. The primary function, of course, is legislation, is government supervision, is transparency, is interaction with civil society. But innovation in Parliament is more and more, and has over the past decades more and more supported, and is more and more supporting Parliament in performing its core functions, in performing its primary functions, which in the meantime, of course, has also created a certain level of awareness among political decision makers, which nowadays makes it a bit easier than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to convince them about the possible advantages of innovation. Nonetheless, it's still a business where, as an innovator, you need good arguments, not only the budgetary argument, but the budgetary argument always is a good argument, but also other good arguments to do the necessary work in convincing the political decision makers, but also, of course, in convincing members of civil society about the improvement that allows them to better interact with Parliament as their representative institution. I hope that this wasn't too much. I hope that I didn't talk too long, but you see, it's an issue that I like to talk about. And in such a case, it can easily happen. Nonetheless, thank you for your interest, and very obviously, Grant, who has listened to my talk, now has some comments.
Thank you, Günther. You raised a lot of interesting points, and I've spoken to you many times before about these. In looking back over the last 40 years, you've seen a lot of change. You've seen a lot of evolution of these systems, but you also made a point that the legislative industry or legal industry in general is slow to adopt, slow to change. What we now, and I've experienced that as well. I know that the Austrian Parliament was one of the innovators early on in 2004 in providing authentic information digitally, and many other parliaments have followed suit. But you did mention one of the differences, and you didn't mention actually the specific difference. I know that the Austrian Parliament publishes authentic code in XHTML, where most jurisdictions that have followed suit publish it as PDF, which to me is just mimicking the paper. It's a digital form of the paper. Now we're at this inflection point where change is coming much, much faster with AI. And we're in a field that has been slow to change and slow to adapt. So today it is much further along than it was 40, 30, 20 years ago. But at the same time, has a lot of catch up to do just to get to where we are today and not where we're headed. How do you see parliaments adapting to the pace of change and doing some level of catch up to fulfill the vision that you put forward?
Well, if I may briefly make a remark, as you are fully right, we started with XHTML as the authentic format, but we switched to signed PDF in 2017. So even Austria followed this international development or international standard, so to say. But the XHTML solution was very satisfying. One important approach towards keeping in line with the overall technical development and the possibilities of technical development, of course, is international cooperation. That's why I also mentioned the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, which has again established a center for innovation in Parliament. It had a global center for ICT in Parliament before, which then was closed down, and a few years later it re-established a center for innovation in Parliament. I think it was in 2017 too, which nowadays, of course, would give a lot of useful recommendations, references to use cases and so on. For example, also in the field of using AI, but not only. International cooperation on the multilateral level, like IPU, but also international cooperation on a bilateral level. For example, we have cooperated with the Hellenic Parliament in several European research projects, and in my opinion, developed some interesting approaches, but at least collected a lot of important knowledge in course of this research cooperation. Cooperation between parliaments, but of course also cooperation between parliaments and private enterprises. Cooperation between parliaments and academic institutions. Think of, for example, the University of Bologna, that has done such a lot of important work in the field of supporting the development of a standard legislative and legal document format. So cooperation, international cooperation, interinstitutional cooperation is one of the major approaches, in my opinion. Very important, of course, is also to have on board and bring on board civil society, your national civil society. A parliament, as a representative institution, has the obligation to, as I mentioned, transparency, regular interaction with civil society, and the new and innovative technologies are the environments where this interaction can happen in the most efficient and effective way. So if the support by civil society, if the awareness in civil society is there, then it is much easier to bring through innovation in a parliament, to convince political decision makers, to convince IT departments. Maybe you also have made the experience that it is not always easy to convince IT departments about innovation. IT departments are often even more conservative than political decision makers, because very obviously they have a lot of applications to take care of, and are not so much interested in changing them in regular intervals. So cooperation, interaction, transparency are, in my opinion, very important drivers.
In your view, you mentioned the work done at the University of Bologna, and we're both well familiar with that. How important do you think technologies like a Komontoso are towards enabling a vision built around AI?
Well, a Komontoso, of course, as we know, is a document description language, which would be very helpful in standardizing document formats, allowing AI-based applications to make the best possible use of these documents, to extract from these documents relevant information. Standardized document description language like this would offer the opportunity to also add semantic tags to documents, and to do this in a machine-supported way, or in an exclusively machine-processed way, because of course this is a business way too large for human annotators. So as it is so important for AI to have big data available as a basis for learning, as a basis for recognizing patterns, as a basis for its analytical work, it is most important to provide the documents, to provide the data in a way making them in the best possible way usable by AI-based application. And standard languages like a Komontoso very obviously can make a very good contribution to improving the document quality with regard to their later reuse by AI application.
Earlier on, you used the term that I like, machine processable, which I prefer over the term machine readable, because it implies a level of capability that goes beyond just being able to read the information. A lot of systems that I come across are more focused on publishing the information than on making it processable. Do you have any thoughts on how authentic? Oftentimes, when authentic information is published, it's a download. It's not usable in the form in which it is authentic. Have you given any thought to how authentic information could be also machine processable?
Well, authenticity is a quality that probably has to be defined differently than 25 years ago. Authenticity in a digital environment is to be understood in a process-oriented way. Is the source of the information the authentic one? If, for example, you look at legal information, nowadays we can easily transform the format of an authentic quotation mark piece of information into any other format, into any other form that this information might have to take in order to be the best possible way reusable, machine readable, machine processable, however you would call it. Authenticity is in the process. Authenticity no longer is in the document. Of course, we have tried even to provide a sort of mimicry of the former authenticity, of the former idea of authenticity. The electronic signature, for example, is a typical type of this mimicry. Nonetheless, we have more than before to focus on the process than on the document itself when talking about authenticity. And an authentic document nowadays, regardless whether published as a signed PDF or as an XHTML, can be either transformed from the authentic way it has been published, or from the source it has come from to be authentically published, to be transformed in a way making it reusable without any loss in quality. That's what, in my opinion, makes authenticity to a concept to be looked at a bit differently than it had been looked at 25 years ago.
One of the things I've been reading about lately is the drop-off in a lot of web traffic to sites as the tools like ChatGPT assimilate that information and then present the simulated information in their own form. To me, that sets off a red flag that you lose track of, you don't know the origin of the information that these AI tools are providing you. You don't know that the information you're getting is actually coming from an authentic source, or even that it has been processed in a way that would preserve that authenticity. Have you given any thought to that?
Well, ChatGPT is relatively young. All the other agents like ChatGPT, there are so many of them nowadays, are quite young. So I'm quite sure that over the next few years, they will develop additional features. And one of the main, I would say, demands we would have to address to these tools or to the tool makers is to provide authentic information about the sources. This would also be very useful to students writing their academic papers by using ChatGPT, because for them nowadays it's easy to get a good text, but it's not easy to get the sources. So everyone would be happy about that. But to come back to our subject, very obviously, as mentioned before, it is the process that claims authenticity, and if the source of an information isn't given, the process is broken. Reference to the source is always keeping up the continuous process of information transformation, and that is why, in my opinion, not just for our reasons and for reason of our demands, but also for demands coming from very different other sides, ChatGPT and similar tools in the future will have features at least available on demand, allowing the readers to track the information sources processed by these tools. And this will also help to avoid hallucination. That's the issue that we have nowadays for ChatGPT. It's very easy to hallucinate because it just can claim anything as long as it hasn't to refer to a source. But I have to make a remark. ChatGPT is also hallucinating about sources. So far, I did an experiment and asked ChatGPT for reference literature to a particular subject. And it actually produced me an impressive list of reference literature with really existing authors and really reasonable titles and really existing publishers. But none of these publications really existed. So this is an aspect that we also have to keep in mind when adding these reference capacities to ChatGPT and similar services. But I'm quite sure that in the years to come, this will be a necessary next step of development.
I had a very similar experience last week where I was asking ChatGPT something very specific about a commentoso, knowing that the answer wasn't there because there was a hole in the commentoso. And ChatGPT just filled in the gap and made up a new commentoso that wasn't there. It was a little alarming to see that. So thank you for your time. Those are my questions.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. It's always a pleasure for me to talk to you.